And now, Dr. Bevilacqua joins us with a presentation on how wellness and lifestyle choices can impact your kidney health.
Really, one of the take-home messages I want to give people is that when we're talking about the concept of wellness, it really is a holistic approach to how somebody is doing. What it specifically is it's not binary, meaning it doesn't just mean one thing and you're either sick or well. It's not like a light switch on or off. And it's not just the absence of a bad illness or the absence of suffering. It's really assessing how someone is doing in all of these very important domains of their life. And I really like this approach that has taken, it has become much more common over the last few years, where we do look at all these various different domains. So yes, we have physical health as being one main component of wellness and the one that a lot of us might immediately think of. But you can see there are all of these other areas that are just as important, because a disruption in any one of them will lead, of course, to unwellness in that area, but then can have a domino or a knock-on effect to all the others. For example, if your physical health is doing well, but your emotional isn't, or you're having trouble in your occupational or work life, you can see how these all feed off of each other. So when you're assessing wellness, we're really looking at this whole spectrum, every component of the individual. And when we're thinking about something like a chronic illness, like kidney issues, or really any chronic problem, again, even though a lot of people might think of that as being a physical thing, it really can impact any of these domains. And the impacts can change as time goes on. When you're really doing an inventory and thinking about what your wellness might be in any one of these domains, I really think that it's important to take stock of two things. And this is what I try to do with some of my patients as well when we're going through this. You take stock of what symptoms are coming up, but also what impact that's having on people. And that will then lead into what we do with it. But I like that it breaks it down into assessing both of these parts, right? So for example, you can say, okay, if somebody's having a lot of issues with fatigue or tiredness, well, that's one thing to say that, I feel fatigued. But then when you start unraveling, how is that impacting you? Has it made it so you can't go to work? You can't do the activities you like to do. You don't have the energy to even get up and socialize with your friends and loved ones. Now you can see that really starts to paint a picture of how that's impacting the person. And we can do the same thing with physical symptoms, right? A common one being something like if someone's having chronic pain, okay, well, how is that limiting you? Is it limiting your ability to get around? Is it limiting your mobility? And you can see that although we might have the same symptom, we can have various different levels of impact. And as we assess that, we sometimes do this as physicians, but this is something that you can take stock of yourself as well. Then it really starts to lead into how you might start to approach it. And we're going to come back to approaching this and strategies to manage impacts on wellness a bit later on. So wellness, to summarize, is not just one item. It covers all of these domains of your well-being. And if you're thinking about this, think about both what's happening and how is it impacting you. I've used an example here of something from polycystic kidney disease. That's why it says this at the beginning. It's one of the things that I do a fair amount of. But this applies to anything. I just like the visual here, so don't worry too much about the specifics. But what I like is that it shows that through the course of somebody's life or through the course of somebody's experience with a chronic condition, we go through a lot of different phases. We often think of it, and sometimes it can be easy to just label it as, oh, this is kidney disease, and it's one item that's kind of there. But there's a whole lot of trajectories we go through. First, people just learn about the diagnosis for the first time, right? So you're newly diagnosed. You get into some basic initial management parts. So maybe the medications and treatments aren't as intense in the early days, and you're focusing on some of these aspects of wellness and your self-management. Through the course, you might go through various treatments. Now, all of a sudden, you're starting a treatment or stopping a treatment or something new or a different procedure, up and down and up and down. And again, those are going to cycle. And then with some of our kidney diseases, some people do go on to then need even more intensive treatments. People might need transplants or dialysis treatments, and then they might go back and forth between some of those. So this is all to say that this isn't a straight line, or this isn't a one-time item when we're talking about a chronic condition. And through these different phases, there's going to be different components of your wellness that might be impacted. In the early days, you might be more of the emotional side of learning about this new diagnosis. And then you go on to a different treatment, for example, and now the physical part of it comes to the forefront. So as you shift through, these items might change. Again, another reason I really believe in that, if this is something that you're tracking, I believe in the concept of things like journaling, where you actually see, okay, how is this changing over time and what's my focal point here and now? One of the things that makes some of these very challenging to manage impacts to wellness is they become, as we call kind of, our technical term is a positive feedback loop, or the term that we use for that is a self-fueling fire. Meaning, if we're talking about something like chronic fatigue or chronic pain, these are very classic examples of this. That if someone's having a lot of issues with tiredness, it's going to be very hard for them to be physically active. And then if they're less physically active, they'll go through a process of what we call deconditioning, meaning if you're less physically active, you lose some strength and some aerobic capacity, which will make it even more hard for you to be active. It will actually feed into make some of the symptoms related to your disease worse. And then that cycle just repeats. It kind of gets harder and harder and harder to break that and get out of it. And the same thing can happen with all various disruptions to wellness, that if we leave them unchecked, they can actually start to feed into that component and other components of wellness, and you kind of just get into this worsening spiral. And that's always the worry. But I want to be here saying that, we can break these cycles. And this is obviously, we're here to talk about strategies. And for each of these, we do have different ways, depending on where we're at, different strategies. And we'll come to this and see a lot, some advertisement for the Wellness Hub, where there's actually some great resources for exactly this type of thing, that depending on which component we're talking about, you're going to want to target it with various different strategies. Again, I've used this for chronic fatigue because there's a lot of good research in this area that shows just how effective implementing some of these strategies can be, where although the process itself, if you kind of let the beast of the process take over and you get into that self-fueling fire, might say, you know what, I'm having tiredness, I don't want to be active, and it gets harder and harder. We say, okay, where can we actually implement some strategies to maybe bring in appropriate small amounts of activity to at least break the cycle, at least disrupt that and not let it take over and get into that positive feedback or that self-feeding fire.